Marines laughed at the grizzled veteran's orange rifle until his 4,000 shot alerted the general. The California sun beat down mercilessly on Camp Pendleton's firing range, casting long shadows across the dusty terrain. Marine recruits clustered in tight groups, their pristine uniforms still bearing factory creases, while they examined their state-of-the-art sniper rifles with the reverence of soldiers touching holy relics. The air hummed with nervous energy and the distant crack of gunfire from adjacent ranges. In the midst of this military precision stood Harold Hal Morrison, a weathered man in his 60s whose civilian clothes hung loose on his wiry frame. His deeply lined face told stories of decades under harsh suns, while his calloused hands gripped an unusual weapon that drew stares and barely suppressed laughter from the young Marines around him. The rifle was painted a garish safety orange, its stock scarred with use, and its scope an ancient model that belonged in a museum rather than a modern military exercise. "Is that thing even legal?" whispered Private Martinez to his squad mate, gesturing toward Hal's weapon with barely concealed amusement. "Looks like something my grandpa would use for deer hunting," replied Corporal Davis, his voice carrying across the range loud enough for Hal to hear. Before we continue, hit that like button and subscribe to discover more stories of heroes whose true worth can't be measured by their equipment or appearance. Hal remained silent, methodically checking his rifle's components with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times. His weathered fingers traced familiar grooves in the orange paint, each mark a testament to years of faithful service. The weapon might have looked like a relic, but every component had been meticulously maintained and upgraded internally where it mattered most. General Patricia Hawkins approached the firing line, her polished boots clicking against the concrete. She surveyed the assembled participants with the sharp eyes of a career military officer who had seen combat in 3 theaters of war. Her gaze lingered momentarily on Hal and his unusual weapon, but her expression remained professionally neutral. "Gentlemen and ladies," she announced, her voice cutting through the desert air, "today's exercise will separate the merely competent from the exceptional. We have targets positioned at various distances, culminating in an extreme-range challenge at 4,000 meters. This distance pushes the absolute limits of precision shooting and will require not just skill, but intimate knowledge of ballistics, wind patterns, and equipment capabilities." The Marines straightened their postures, suddenly serious. 4,000 meters was beyond what most had ever attempted, even in training scenarios. It was the kind of distance that separated legends from ordinary marksmen. "Mr. Morrison," the general continued, addressing Hal directly, "I understand you volunteered to demonstrate some alternative approaches to long-range precision shooting." Hal nodded quietly, his voice carrying the rough texture of a lifetime smoker when he finally spoke. "Yes, ma'am, been doing this sort of work for 43 years. Figured these young folks might benefit from seeing how it was done before computers did all the thinking." Another wave of barely suppressed chuckles rippled through the Marine ranks. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present, this civilian with his ancient-looking equipment presuming to teach elite military snipers about their own craft. Staff Sergeant Collins, a decorated marksman with 2 combat tours, stepped forward. "Sir, with respect, modern sniper systems have evolved considerably. We use laser rangefinders, ballistic computers, and precision-manufactured ammunition. That equipment represents decades of technological advancement." Hal's weathered face cracked into a slight smile. "Son, I don't doubt your gear is impressive, but shooting isn't about the rifle, it's about the shooter. These old eyes have been reading wind and calculating drop since before you were born. Sometimes experience trumps technology." The challenge was implicit, but unmistakable. The stage was set for a demonstration that would either validate decades of military advancement or humble an entire generation of warriors who had forgotten that true skill transcends equipment. The morning briefing took place in a prefabricated building that smelled of coffee and cleaning solution. Maps covered every available wall space, displaying the complex terrain of Camp Pendleton's extended ranges. General Hawkins stood before a detailed topographical chart, pointing to various positions marked with colored pins. The 4,000-meter target sits beyond that ridge, she explained, indicating a distant hill barely visible through the building's windows. Wind patterns in that valley are notoriously unpredictable, shifting between thermal currents from the desert floor and cooling air masses from the Pacific. It's a shot that challenges every aspect of marksmanship fundamentals. Private Johnson raised his hand tentatively. "Ma'am, what's the military record for a confirmed kill at that distance?" "Classified," the general replied curtly, "but I can tell you it's been achieved fewer than a dozen times in combat situations. Today's exercise isn't about records. It's about pushing boundaries and learning from different approaches to the same problem." After the briefing, the Marines gathered around their equipment tables, methodically checking their rifles and conducting pre-firing procedures. Their weapons represented the pinnacle of military engineering: carbon fiber stocks, precision-machined barrels, and electronic scopes capable of automatically adjusting for wind and elevation. Each rifle cost more than most people's annual salary. Meanwhile, Hal sat alone on a weathered wooden bench, his orange rifle resting across his knees. He pulled a worn notebook from his shirt pocket, its pages filled with handwritten calculations, wind readings, and atmospheric data collected over decades of shooting. The margins contained sketches of terrain features and detailed notes about how different weather conditions affected bullet trajectory. Sergeant Miller, curious despite himself, approached Hal's position. "Mind if I ask about that rifle, sir? It's unique." Hal looked up, his gray eyes reflecting decades of accumulated wisdom. "Built her myself, piece by piece, over 20 years. Started with a surplus action from a rifle that served in Vietnam. Every component has been selected, tested, and refined through thousands of rounds. The orange paint isn't for looks. It's a safety requirement from my days working petroleum pipeline security in Alaska." Pipeline security, Miller's interest was genuine now. 30 years protecting oil infrastructure in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. Temperatures that would freeze your breath, winds that could knock a man down, and shots that had to count because there might not be a second chance. You learn to make equipment work when failure isn't an option. Staff Sergeant Collins overheard the conversation and joined them. "No disrespect, sir, but pipeline work is different from military precision shooting. We're dealing with human targets, not equipment." Hal's expression hardened slightly. "Son, I spent 2 tours in Vietnam before you were born, then 20 years in law enforcement, followed by 3 decades in industrial security. I've taken shots that mattered in situations where missing meant people died. The targets might change, but precision is precision." The revelation shifted the atmosphere perceptibly. This wasn't just some aging civilian hobbyist. This was a combat veteran whose experience spanned multiple eras of American military history. The Marines exchanged glances, suddenly uncertain about their initial dismissive attitudes. "The rifle might look like a museum piece," Hal continued, "but everything that matters is modern where it counts. The barrel is match grade, the trigger has been worked by a master gunsmith, and the scope, while it looks old, has been rebuilt with current optical technology. Sometimes the most effective solutions don't look impressive to people who don't know what they're seeing." General Hawkins appeared beside their group, having approached unnoticed during the conversation. "Mr. Morrison, I believe it's time to demonstrate whether experience can compete with technology. Gentlemen, let's proceed to the firing line." The moment of truth was approaching, and the Marines were beginning to realize that their assumptions about the grizzled veteran and his unconventional weapon might have been premature. The firing line stretched across a reinforced concrete platform, with shooting positions marked by sandbags and adjustable rests. Each Marine took their assigned spot, their precision rifles gleaming in the afternoon sun. Electronic displays showed wind speed, direction, and atmospheric pressure readings updated in real time. The technology was impressive, representing millions of dollars in research and development. Hal took position at the far end of the line, his orange rifle looking increasingly out of place among the military hardware. He declined the offer of electronic wind meters and ballistic computers, instead pulling out a small leather pouch containing bits of dried grass and feathers. He released a pinch into the air, watching intently as the materials drifted and danced in the invisible currents. "Old-school wind reading," he explained to Private Martinez, who was positioned beside him. "Electronics tell you what's happening here, but they can't predict what's happening downrange. Wind is like water. It flows around obstacles, creates eddies and currents that change by the second." The first phase of the exercise involved targets at conventional distances, 800, 1200, and 1600 meters. The Marines performed admirably, their modern equipment and training producing tight groups and consistent accuracy. Their electronic scopes automatically calculated drop and windage, while integrated ballistic computers provided real-time firing solutions. Hal's performance was quietly impressive. His shots grouped consistently, though his method appeared almost primitive by comparison. He made calculations on paper, using formulas memorized decades ago, and adjusted his scope manually between shots. Yet his bullets found their targets with mechanical precision. "Not bad for an antique," Corporal Davis admitted grudgingly after watching Hal place 5 consecutive shots within a 6-inch group at 1600 meters. Staff Sergeant Collins checked his own target through binoculars, frowning slightly. "His groups are as tight as ours, maybe tighter. That shouldn't be possible with equipment that old." General Hawkins observed everything from an elevated position behind the firing line, making notes on a tablet while speaking quietly into a radio headset. Other officers had joined her, drawn by reports of the unusual civilian participant who was keeping pace with elite military snipers using equipment that belonged in a museum. The afternoon heat intensified as they prepared for the final challenge, the 4,000-meter shot that had humbled countless marksmen over the years. At this distance, the target was barely visible even through high-powered spotting scopes. Bullets would travel for several seconds, crossing multiple wind zones and elevation changes that could deflect a projectile by several meters. "Gentlemen," General Hawkins announced, "the final phase will consist of 3 shots per participant. Due to ammunition constraints and the complexity of target verification at this distance, each shooter will fire individually while others observe. We'll begin with volunteer candidates." Several Marines eagerly stepped forward, confident in their abilities and equipment. The first shooter, Sergeant Williams, took his position and began the careful process of ranging and calculation. His electronic systems provided a firing solution within seconds, accounting for atmospheric conditions, ballistics, and predicted wind patterns. His first shot was close, impacting approximately 2 meters from the target center. The second shot moved closer, demonstrating the value of spotting and adjustment. His third shot was impressive, striking within the outer ring of the scoring zone. Subsequent shooters achieved similar results, creditable accuracy at an extreme distance, but nothing exceptional. The electronic systems performed as designed, providing consistent data that translated into predictable results. Finally, only Hal remained. He had spent the previous hour in quiet observation, making notes in his weathered journal and occasionally releasing bits of grass to read wind conditions. His preparation appeared almost ritualistic, methodical in a way that suggested decades of established routine. "Your turn, sir," General Hawkins announced. Hal approached the firing position, his orange rifle drawing stares from the assembled Marines and observers. He settled into position with the careful movements of someone whose joints had paid the price for a lifetime of physical demands, yet whose muscle memory remained sharp and reliable. The moment everyone had been anticipating was finally at hand. Hal settled behind his rifle with the deliberate movements of someone who had performed this ritual countless times under conditions far more challenging than a controlled military range. His weathered hands found their familiar positions on the weapon, and his breathing automatically shifted into the controlled rhythm that separated casual shooters from true marksmen. "Range is 4127 meters by my calculation," he announced quietly, having used a combination of map references, visual estimation, and mathematical formulas that predated GPS technology. "Temperature is 89 degrees Fahrenheit, barometric pressure is dropping slightly, and humidity is approximately 34%. Staff Sergeant Collins checked his electronic instruments, his eyebrows rising slightly. "Sir, that's exactly what our systems are showing." Hal allowed himself a small smile. "Like I said, son, the tools might change, but the physics don't." He pulled out his worn notebook, consulting pages filled with handwritten data tables and environmental corrections. His calculations were performed with a pencil stub and a small slide rule, tools that seemed impossibly archaic compared to the digital displays surrounding him. Yet his numbers matched the computer-generated solutions with uncanny accuracy. "Wind is the challenge," he continued, speaking to no one in particular while making minute adjustments to his scope. "At this distance, a bullet spends over 4 seconds in flight. Wind conditions change along the entire trajectory. What you're feeling here means nothing compared to what's happening in that valley 2 miles out." General Hawkins moved closer, genuinely curious about Hal's methods. "How can you possibly predict wind conditions at that distance without sensors?" Hal pointed toward the distant target area, his finger tracing invisible paths through the air. "See how the heat shimmer moves differently over there. Watch the dust patterns on that far ridge. Look at how the vegetation bends, not just direction, but the rhythm of movement. Wind isn't just data points, it's a living thing with patterns and personality." He made a final adjustment to his scope, then settled into his firing position. The Marines fell silent, their earlier skepticism replaced by grudging respect and intense curiosity. Even the most experienced among them had never seen anyone attempt this kind of shot, using methods that predated their father's military service. The first shot broke the afternoon quiet with a sharp crack that echoed across the valley. Through spotting scopes, observers watched for the bullet's impact, but nothing was visible near the target. Murmurs of disappointment began to ripple through the group until a radio crackled to life. "Downrange, observer to firing line. Shot impact recorded at 4089 meters, approximately 15 meters short of target. Excellent windage correction, bullet passed directly through the target's horizontal plane." Hal nodded thoughtfully, making notes in his journal. "Winds lighter than I calculated in the middle section. Temperature inversion is affecting the trajectory more than expected." His second shot came 10 minutes later, after careful observation and recalculation. This time, the radio report was immediate and excited. "Impact at target distance, approximately 3 meters left of center. Outstanding correction from previous shot." The Marines exchanged glances. 2 shots had moved progressively closer to a target that represented one of the most challenging marksmanship problems in modern military training. The old man with his orange rifle was systematically solving a puzzle that had frustrated marksmen with far superior equipment. For his final shot, Hal spent nearly 15 minutes in preparation. He released multiple samples of grass into the air, watching their drift patterns with the intensity of a scientist studying atmospheric physics. His calculations filled 2 pages of his notebook, showing complex formulas that accounted for factors the Marines had never considered. "This one's for all the young soldiers who think new is always better," he muttered under his breath, settling into his final firing position. The shot rang out across the valley, and every pair of binoculars immediately focused on the distant target. For several seconds, silence stretched across the firing line as observers searched for the bullet's impact. Then the radio exploded with excitement. "Direct hit, center ring. Outstanding shot, firing line." The implications of what had just happened were still sinking in when another voice came over the radio, this one belonging to a senior officer observing from a forward position. "General Hawkins, you need to get out here immediately. That shot just did something extraordinary." General Hawkins arrived at the forward observation post 30 minutes later, her vehicle kicking up dust clouds as it raced across the desert terrain. The distant target area, normally accessible only by specialized all-terrain vehicles, bustled with activity as range safety officers and target verification teams documented what had occurred. Lieutenant Colonel Bradley met her at the observation bunker, his expression a mixture of amazement and disbelief. "Ma'am, you're going to want to see this personally. That civilian just accomplished something that's going to rewrite our understanding of extreme-range marksmanship." The target itself told only part of the story. Hal's final bullet had indeed struck the center ring, but the significance went far beyond simple accuracy. The projectile had passed through the target and continued downrange, where it had struck and destroyed a surveillance drone that had been conducting routine reconnaissance flights over the training area. The drone was at 43-47 meters from the original firing position, Lieutenant Colonel Bradley explained, consulting his tablet, moving at approximately 40 knots in a crosswind pattern. The bullet struck the main rotor assembly, causing complete system failure. The drone crashed in a controlled descent, but it was effectively neutralized by what appears to be a completely accidental shot. General Hawkins studied the data, her military mind immediately grasping the tactical implications. "Accidental. That's what we assumed initially. But then we received this radio transmission from Morrison himself." The lieutenant colonel played back a recording from the firing line. "This is Hal Morrison to downrange observers. Be advised that shot was calculated to pass through the target and intercept the surveillance drone operating in grid square 347 to 521. Drone neutralization was intentional and demonstrative." The silence that followed this revelation was profound. A civilian with an orange hunting rifle had not only made a precision shot at over 4,000 meters, but had deliberately calculated a second intercept point to disable a moving aerial target. The level of mathematical precision and environmental awareness required for such a feat was beyond what most military professionals considered humanly possible. "Has anyone verified these claims?" General Hawkins asked. "We found his notebook at the firing line. Ma'am, his calculations include trajectory plots for both the primary target and the drone intercept. He mapped the drone's flight pattern by observation, calculated its speed and heading, then determined the precise timing required for bullet intercept. The mathematics are extraordinary." Back at the firing line, Hal was quietly packing his equipment while surrounded by Marines who no longer saw him as an amusing civilian curiosity. Word of his accomplishment had spread quickly through the camp, and officers were arriving from multiple commands to witness the aftermath of what was being called the most remarkable marksmanship demonstration in modern military history. Staff Sergeant Collins approached Hal hesitantly. "Sir, I owe you an apology. We all do. What you just accomplished." Hal looked up from his rifle case, his weathered face showing the faint smile of someone who had proven a point without needing to humiliate anyone in the process. "Son, there's nothing to apologize for. Your equipment is impressive and your training is excellent. But sometimes experience and understanding matter more than technology." Private Martinez stepped forward. "Sir, could you teach us some of those calculation methods, the way you read wind patterns?" "Those old techniques aren't secrets," Hal replied. "They're just knowledge that's been forgotten in the rush toward digital solutions. Every one of you has the capability to learn what I know. It just takes time, practice, and patience." General Hawkins arrived back at the firing line to find Hal surrounded by eager Marines, his notebook open as he explained the mathematical relationships between atmospheric pressure, temperature gradients, and bullet trajectory. The orange rifle that had been an object of ridicule hours earlier was now being examined with the reverence reserved for historical artifacts. "Mr. Morrison," she interrupted the impromptu lesson, "I'd like to discuss a potential consulting position with our advanced marksmanship program. Your methods could revolutionize how we approach extreme-range shooting." Hal closed his notebook and stood slowly. "General, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not looking for a job. However, I'd be happy to spend time with these young folks, sharing what I've learned over the years. Knowledge should be passed down, not buried." As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the Pacific horizon, the story of Hal Morrison and his orange rifle was already spreading throughout the military community. Within hours, the account would reach Pentagon offices and training facilities worldwide, sparking discussions about the balance between technology and fundamental skills. That old rifle just made a shot that would change military history forever, proving that sometimes the greatest weapons are wielded by those humble enough to let their actions speak louder than their equipment. The Marines had learned something invaluable that day. True expertise doesn't always come in the newest package, and heroes often hide in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to remind the world that experience and wisdom never go out of style.